By now, you've probably seen some of our other videos that promoted our Pinetum Hatch fundraiser at the Illinois State University Horticulture Center. And many people generously donated to help us exceed our fundraising goals by a really healthy margin. We want to convey our sincere thanks to the 84 donors who helped us raise $15,200, more than two-thirds again as much as our initial campaign goal. Now that the campaign is ending, we are releasing our most visually tantalizing video yet to show our supporters our appreciation and hopefully inspire you to plant some conifers in your own garden. While we've talked about garden design with conifers, their winter interest, champion conifers, and other fun facts, until now, we've intentionally stayed away from the months of April through June. As the winter buds break to give way to fresh new foliage and cones, gardeners learn really quickly that the spring show is the high point to anticipate every year. You'll see the plants are really doing all the work here, and indeed, conifers are anything but boring. They sell themselves, so sit back and enjoy this primetime special brought to you by the original four-season ornamental plants. As evergreen leaves weather a long winter, it's just a fact of life that they will lose a bit of their luster. But that only amplifies the vibrance that comes from new shoots, or the leaves and stems, as they emerge from their winter buds. Take the familiar blue Colorado spruce. The new growth emerges a powdery blue. The cultivar hoopsii, pictured here, is considered the bluest of the blue. In May, the new needles feel soft and rubbery, but by June, they harden to become among the sharpest of spruces. In general, the emerging foliage is brighter in color on almost every species of pine, fir, or spruce, which makes a striking contrast with evergreen leaves produced in previous years. If we're talking about new foliage, this is where we have to mention the chameleon plants. These are the plants whose foliage emerges in unexpected color, then gradually fades to the usual green as the new growth hardens by midsummer. Probably the most striking chameleon plant is a lodgepole pine, the species that carpets the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and Wyoming, called Taylor's sunburst. The new growth, which on a pine we call candles, emerges a bright golden yellow. As the needles expand, they transition to paler shades of yellow before finally maturing to a matte green. But for about 6 weeks, this plant will be a torch right at the center of your garden. Another sought-after conifer is the oriental spruce. It has the tiniest needles of any spruce, resembling a little green grain of rice. Yet needles on the cultivar Oreo variegata emerge electric yellow before fading back to deep green. They'll remain in their incognito green garb for about 11 months until the following spring. While the Norway spruce is one of the most frequently planted large conifers for windbreaks and borders, its widespread planting over the past few hundred years in nurseries and gardens across the globe have given rise to more cultivars than perhaps any member of the pine family. Chameleons abound with this species too, but one of the most unexpected colors in all sprucedom comes from the red new growth of the cultivar Rubra spicata. It emerges blood red and fades to olive green red before assuming the predictable dark green shared with other Norway spruces. The Colorado spruce, called Gabelle's Golden Spring, works along these same lines. Butter yellow new growth fades to gray-green by late spring. Spring is also the time that the deciduous conifers shine. Since their leaves don't have to weather the vagaries of winter, needles on larch feel succulent and pliable from spring until they drop in autumn, but they are still most vibrant right after they emerge from their winter buds. It's hard to imagine anything more verdant in spring than this dwarf version of Japanese larch. Here, we're seeing its leaf emergence in April. Or take its larger weeping sibling, Pendula, shown here in May, a little further along in its needle emergence. One standout among the larches is a bushy American larch called Blue Sparkler. Here, the name says it all. A quick diversion to the redwood family, and we see this dawn redwood called Gold Rush, its translucent yellow leaves resplendent in the sun's rays. If your heart isn't already racing from all this foliage, then the spring coning will certainly get you there. Maybe you've never seen anything like this, but yes, the cones on the familiar blue spruce really are magenta. Why don't we see these in our everyday landscapes? Well, it has to do with the biology of conifer reproduction. In the landscape, we typically see the standard large blue spruce, but spruce, fir, and many other members of the pine family only bear their female seed cones in the top 1/3 to 1/4 of the crown. On standard spruce fare, this means the cones hang well above our heads. Most people never notice them simply because they don't know to be on the lookout. Meanwhile, separate male pollen cones occupy the bottom 2/3 of the canopy and shed thick clouds of yellow pollen. The pollen has to land on the tiny scale of a female seed cone in order to achieve successful pollination. So this is really a game of probability. Famously, in areas where pines are native, yellow pollen accumulates on cars, patios, and decks like a dusting of sulfur yellow snow. Conifer pollen is carried upwards and downwind by warm spring air currents. Only a tiny fraction of pollen grains beat the odds and win this gamble when they land on the female cones of neighboring trees. Pollination is the prize that ultimately leads to the next generation of offspring. At pollination, the male half of the DNA, carried in the pollen grain and originating from a pollen cone, unites with the female half of the DNA contained in each female cone scale. Isolation of the two genders in separate reproductive structures is an evolutionary mechanism that ensures cross-pollination. That means one tree receives pollen from another member of the same species or a different, but at least compatible species for breeding. Cross-pollination assures better mixing of genetic traits, which increases the chance that the resulting seed will grow into more robust trees than their parents. So how do we work with plants' Darwinian tendencies to eke out the maximum ornamental benefit in our gardens? One possibility is to grow those conifer cultivars that possess irregular growth habits, the weepers, spreaders, or other abstract forms. Something like this weeping blue Colorado spruce puts coning closer to eye level, where we can comfortably peer into the top of its canopy to appreciate the cones. Notice that even on this sprawling plant, the reddish female cones are clustered atop the plant with the withered male cones beneath. The other way to bring cones down to eye level is to select plants that are genetically programmed to be shrub-like or otherwise slower growers. Such a tree ends up smaller for its age, and if it also happens to produce an abundance of cones, then we've really found the golden ticket to appreciate coning. This brings us to another term that every conifer enthusiast has to add to his or her vocabulary: annual growth rate. If you're not sure how conifers measure up, the American Conifer Society classifies the size of conifers by their annual rate of growth. At one time or another, most gardeners have probably read the description on the tag of a familiar deciduous shade tree or ornamental. Something like, say, a Japanese maple would just indicate the ultimate height and spread when the tree reaches maturity. So why not use this same system for conifers? Basically, most conifers live longer than humans, provided we plant them in the right places, so they will keep growing at more or less fixed growth rates for decades or even centuries. The longer they live, the bigger they grow. Want to know how big your conifer will grow in 10 years, 30 years, or even 100 years? Just multiply the age by the American Conifer Society classification for a particular tree's annual growth rate. Most wild, forest-type conifers, when grown from seed, are considered large trees, which you can see here grow up to 12 inches annually. Some, like eastern white pine or Norway spruce, are even classified as very large trees. Remember that very large Colorado spruce? The one we would find growing in the forest or a typical landscape? The cones are way at the top and mostly out of sight. We can't enjoy them way up there. That's where most of the intermediate, dwarf, and even miniature conifers come in. Savvy plants people make grafted cultivar selections to bring cones into view. Not to mention, they give gardeners options that fit practically any garden niche one could fathom. This dwarf form of Norway spruce, called push, grows 2 to 3 inches each year and produces abundant cones from almost every single branch in the spring. While conifers are not flowering plants, again, biologically speaking, the mass of ruby red cones for about 3 weeks in April to May provides the ornamental equivalent of a flowering shrub. And don't forget, this is an evergreen plant that also gives us 12 months of evergreen foliage and woody cones to enjoy throughout the winter. A heavy coning dwarf conifer is truly the holy grail of woody plants for our temperate gardens. Not surprisingly, this cultivar push has become relatively easy to find at garden centers in the past few years. And if you're planting a grouping of dwarf spruces, planting this cultivar over the older bird's nest spruce, which lacks cones, seems like a no-brainer. Oh, and an insider's tip. Be on the lookout in the next few years for a dwarf blue Colorado spruce called ruby teardrops that works the same way as the Norway spruce, only with cones perched atop steely blue leaves. With these recent innovations, we are on the cusp of a conifer renaissance. The male pollen cones can be just as showy as female cones, but because they are smaller than the female cones, they have to be viewed from even closer. Take the red pollen cones of the oriental spruce. Note that these can be viewed from the ground because, as we said, male cones reside in the lower portions of the crown. One of the most alluring male cone displays is on the relatively common concolor fir, seen here on ISU's campus. The cones swell bright pink before opening to shed their yellow pollen grains in the breeze. Now that we've provided a foundation to help us make sense of what we're seeing in spring, new growth, male pollen cones, and female seed cones, we can sit back and enjoy the spring sensations from several standout conifers. Let's start from the beginning with Abies, the true firs. Without question, a universal favorite garden conifer is a Korean fir called Silberlock, in German, literally silver hair. The needles recurve around the twigs to reveal their snow-white undersides. Fresh spring growth appears dusted with snow, and the needles stay inverted for us to enjoy this curious trait year-round. Thankfully, this cultivar is pretty easy to find at the discerning garden center. Take one home, watch it every spring, and eventually you will see a heavy coning or mast year. One nursery grower, intrigued by the prospects of what genetic anomalies might lie inside the seeds hanging from a parent with these inverted silver needles, may well have made himself a small fortune when one of those seedlings turned out to be a dwarf version of Silberlock. He named his selection Icebreaker. The seedling bears needles just like the parent, only it's a dwarf that grows just 2 inches a year. When it comes to coning, Korean fir is also an all-around home run hitter. The golden Korean fir heats up the garden with its yellow-orange cones, like little tiki torches. You can also cool off by planting one of many cultivars that feature vivid royal purple cones. Endemic to the Rocky Mountains, both concolor fir and subalpine fir, particularly its variety called Arizona corkbark fir, bear attractive powder blue needles for most of the year. In spring, however, the new growth contrasts in seafoam green, definitely unexpected. What's more, both species go on to produce lavender purple seed cones. Blood pumping yet? Get ready for the spruces. We've already seen coning on Norway spruce and the blue Colorado spruce. Did you know there's also a golden Colorado spruce? Of course there is. Even more bizarre, its cones match the golden yellow of the needles. One A-list celebrity conifer is a bicolor spruce called Howell's dwarf. It's a gardener's favorite because it reliably produces an abundance of cones, and, like we said earlier, its dwarf frame keeps them low to the ground. It really looks like this evergreen conifer is blooming right now in mid-May. There's a lot to process in this photo, from the purple-red cones to the expired male pollen cones to the fresh yellow-green new needles. By now, hopefully, you're starting to make sense of all this. Fast forward, and this is what the picture will look like in another month. That's when they become the cone that most of us have known our entire lives. Speaking of familiarity, what about the pines? After all, they are the namesake of this plant family. Well, they work a little differently in that they actually take 2 years to go from a reproductive bud to a mature seed cone. In year 1, male pollen cones emerge on the new shoots called candles and shed their pollen. At the same time, female cones emerge from different candles. They receive the pollen when they are very small, at which point their development pauses until the next year. In spring of year 2, the female cones then expand as the seeds inside grow to maturity. In year 2, female cones of the Swiss stone pine turn heads as they turn smoky indigo in May. You can see this at the Horticulture Center's Pinetum right now. Seed cones on pine keep expanding until late summer, at which point they turn woody in the process called lignification. As far as coning goes on pines, Japan was endowed by Mother Nature with 2 species that add up to a great wealth of color. The Japanese stone pine bears fluorescent pink-red along candles as they emerge in spring. It's a spreader with really silvery green needles that give it year-round appeal. Finally, our long crescendo of conifer color in this video culminates in the spring show provided by the Japanese white pine. There are hundreds of cultivars of this species, but let's start with a proven standby, glauca, which means blue. Take in this photo for a moment. To describe it in a word, blue. But there's a lot more than that. We see lavender purple pollen cones, powdery blue seed cones now expanding in their second year, and green needles emerging from candles. We even see an abundance of woody cones from previous years. If we zoom in on the pollen cones, we see the lavender purple complements this pastel palette, all very zen. But we said there are multiple forms of this species. The cultivar Bergmanni steals the show with an abundance of carmine red pollen cones covering every candle. This is about as good as conifer gardening gets. Hopefully, all the photos you've just seen compel you to visit the Pinetum at the Horticulture Center as we work this summer to implement Phase 2, which so many of our supporters have helped to make a reality. Not only will this phase include many new conifers, but you will also see the incorporation of broad-leaved trees, shrubs, and herbaceous perennials that make appropriate companion plants alongside the specimen conifers. April through June is the best season both to plant and to enjoy conifers, so it's a good time to look for them at your local garden centers. Soft, succulent conifers are just too hard to resist in the spring. Bet you can't just try one. If more trips to the garden center than not, you end up bringing back a conifer for your garden, then you've probably caught the condition known as addicted to conifers syndrome. As you seek out the more elusive cultivars, it might help to let your garden center know what you are looking for. Sometimes they have to search far and wide to track down the more unique conifers, but with a little luck, you might just be rewarded for your patience. So what are you waiting for?